Hey, this is John, and welcome back to Olive Grove Woodshop. In this episode, I'll give you a great example of why the simplest designs are sometimes the hardest by redesigning a piece halfway into the build and going through the finish process twice because of a boneheaded mistake. So here I'm laying out a leg template for a console table, but it's not just any console table. This is a console table from my own house that's been many years in the making. About 6 years ago, my wife and I decided it was time to take the leap, and we started looking for a piece of property to build our forever home on. We've been working towards this plan ever since the day we bought our first house 17 years ago. Step one of that plan was to buy our first house, which ended up being a real fixer-upper whose interior was all original from when it was built in 1974 because that's all we could afford at the time. And then we'd spend the next few years fixing it up, all while saving up to buy a decent-sized piece of property to one day build on. Now, the original plan was we'd sell the first house in about 5 years or so, take the profits from that, buy a bigger, newer home to raise a family in, and then hopefully there'd be enough left over to put towards the piece of property, and then fingers crossed we'd be able to build our dream home by the time our yet-to-be-born children were getting into high school. Now, it was a well-thought-out and achievable goal, but we forgot about the most important rule when making major life plans. And that's that life's got one hell of an arm and it throws a mean curveball. All in all, everything was going according to plan. It was moving a little slower than we'd hoped, but our next step was within our sights. We'd been in the house about 5 years and had just welcomed our first daughter into this world when life decided to unleash a whammy of a curveball. One minute I was sitting in my truck waiting on the car in front of me to take a turn, and the next I was strapped to a board in an ambulance doing Mach 20 on the way to the hospital. The next few days were a blur of ambulance rides, hospital stays, every scan you can think of, and pain on a level that I had never experienced. Turns out there was someone coming up behind me that had forgot about those things called brakes while doing 60 miles an hour, and I'm pretty sure the only reason I'm still here is because Toyota makes one hell of a pickup truck. I only remember bits and pieces of the early days after the accident, due to a pretty serious brain injury, and along with taking some heavy stuff to help with a number of nerve and spinal issues that would be with me for the rest of my life. And I'm the first to admit that I'm incredibly lucky, not only for still being here, but for having an amazing partner that was there to help me get through a long recovery, all while working full-time, caring for a newborn, and somehow maintaining her sanity. Somehow we made it through those early years after the accident, and not long after our second daughter came along. Things were actually starting to look up. I was finally able to get back to work, and I had most of my injuries under control. And just as things were settling down, that fickle mistress that we call life must have thought I was crowding the plate, because I got hit with the heater right in the old noggin. I was having a routine procedure that I had done dozens of times, but this time it up and went south. And the next thing I knew, a group of surgeons comes barreling in to whisk me into an emergency spinal surgery, while saying they'll hopefully be able to minimize any permanent paralysis. Now, for some reason I've yet to fathom, I'm still here, and aside from the whole lack of short-term memory, a heap of chronic pain, a dash of neuropathy, and a mean case of muscle spasms that makes using the table saw a little spicy, things actually turned out pretty good. So I'm bringing all this up for a few reasons. One, it's the reason why sometimes I have to get a little creative in how I accomplish tasks in the shop that leaves you wondering if I'm crazy or just plain stupid. And plot twist, it's a bit of both. It's also why every so often my arms are jerking like I just took a shot of shine on account of the damn spasms. And then in general, it just takes me longer to do things because I move a little slower, can't get after it the way I used to, and can't remember the things I'm supposed to be doing, or where the hell my damn tape measure went to again. Now, the main reason I just took you for a stroll down that dusty old lime rock road that washes out every time it rains, memory lane that winds through my head, is to explain why it took me so long to build this console table. For anyone who hasn't built a custom home or is thinking about doing it, it takes a couple of years to go from undeveloped land to a ready to move into new home. Especially if you do it in the middle of that blur in everyone's life called COVID, when everything cost twice as much and took 10 times longer to get there. For us, it took around 3 years. So as we got closer to pulling the trigger on this whole adventure, we decided that instead of replacing our furniture that had been beat to death by 2 wild hellions and a couple of coonhounds, before we moved into a new house was just a waste of money, since the main reason furniture gets damaged is during a move. So we decided to try and keep ours together with duct tape, drywall screws, and a little bit of luck. Which meant the day we moved into our new home that we'd spend the rest of our lives in, we barely had a stick of furniture. And somehow I was able to convince my wife that I'd be able to build a good bit of it in a timely manner. So anyways, that didn't happen. And 3 years later, here we are making the first of many pieces destined for our now newish house, all of which have to be squeezed in between commission builds for clients. Alright, now getting back to the task at hand. This slab I'm cutting down for the top is some old growth mulberry that I picked up a ways back with no real intention of what to use it for. It was one of those hot deals that you just can't pass up. Now this joker is hard as iron and just as heavy, but it's got some really nice grain to it. All in all, for being an old slab, it's actually in pretty decent shape. But you can see here as I squared up on the joiner that it's got a few decent cracks and splits in it. But it's nothing that can't be cleaned up with a little bit of epoxy. Now when it comes to epoxy, I don't go through a ton of it. Aside from the occasional river table, I only use it to fill knots and cracks and things like you see on this table. And because I don't go through it that often, it ends up sitting around, sometimes a little too long, as you'll find out later in this video, because this epoxy was probably a good year old, and although it seemed fine at the time, it ended up costing me a headache down the road. All that aside, I was wrapping up as much as I could do with the top before it was time to turn my attention to the legs. So as I was getting set up to trim down the legs with the template I'd cut out earlier, I realized that my design was terrible. It was just too chunky, and the 90-degree angle was just not good looking. So I decided to punt and redesign the base with a more angular look. And then I figured while I was at it, why not dig through my pile of curly maple and give this base a little bit more character that the ambrosia maple was just missing. I'm using templates for a few reasons, but the main one is there will be 4 identical pieces making up the base of this piece. And when you have curved legs, it can be difficult to duplicate them when using a bandsaw and spindle sander to cut and refine the legs. And the symmetry is pretty important because of the way I designed this base. So anytime you're making narrow legs that have any sort of intersecting angles, you need to account for the weak areas when it comes to the wood grain. If I were to cut this leg out of a single board, one of the sides would have the grain running perpendicular to the length, which would make it incredibly weak. What you want to do is have the grain running parallel with the length. Now luckily an easy solution is what I'm doing here, and that is to make the leg out of 2 pieces, so each one is utilizing the natural strength of the wood's grain. Another tip is to make your joint like a miter versus a butt joint. It adds strength to the joint and it looks a lot better. That said, I'll be the first to acknowledge that I'm lucky enough to have a domino, and that makes it a lot easier to create this joint and to make sure it's strong enough. But the real benefit of the domino is the amount of time it saves you. And for me, this is a huge factor because my shop time is limited to any free time I have on the weekends. But in reality, you can accomplish the same thing with dowels. Now the next trick was figuring out how to clamp the awkward angular piece that I'm working with. But luckily I'm a scrap hoarder, so I could just trim some triangle blocks from some cherry scrap and stick it on with a little bit of CA glue, and I'd be good to go. Another tip is to take some time and figure out where's the best spot to put your clamping blocks. That way when you get ready to glue up, you can make sure that you're getting the right amount of pressure on the right spot of the joint. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that it really is worth it to take your time, do some dry fitting, and kind of run through how you're going to clamp everything together. Because there's nothing worse than figuring out right in the middle of a glue up that you forgot to account for something, and now you've got glue on everything, the clock is running, and you're scrambling, which only means you're going to mess something up. But lucky for me, I actually did plan everything out this time, and the dry fit went nice and smooth, so that means it's time to glue this baby up. Another thing you can do if you have a domino when you're working with joints like this is to keep it on the setting that actually makes the holes a little bit bigger than they need to be, and so it allows you a little bit of wiggle room as you line everything up. Another nice thing about using scraps for your clamping blocks is that when you're done with them, all you got to do is give them a good thwap with the hammer, and then you can get on to the next part of the build. So now I'm just cutting the straight piece that all the legs will connect to form the body of the base. Now that I have all the pieces roughed out, I can finally set everything up to get a first look at the base that's been kicking around in my head ever since I decided to abandon the original design, which I'm pretty sure was the right call, because the original legs were just too chunky, the 90-degree angle just looked too bulky, and it just wasn't going to work with the overall look that I was going for. But still, anytime you decide to abandon a design in the middle of building a piece, you're always left wondering if you made a mistake, and you never really know. But looking back at this piece, I'm confident that I made the right call. Now, another thing that I like to do is to wait to bring everything down to its final thickness until I get closer to assembly. It just helps out with any beating, banging that goes on as I'm moving stuff around, and the fact that I don't work from a pre-measured set of plans. So it just gives me the freedom to make any last-minute tweaks as the design's going on, based on how things are looking at the time. And so far, it's worked out pretty good for me. And now we're down to the point of no return, where you're making the final cuts on the pieces before gluing everything up. And there's always that risk of screwing up. So when I decided to switch to curly maple, I knew I was going to need to do something to highlight the unique textures of the wood. And so adding a 15-degree chamfer on the inside of all the legs, and then a thumbnail profile on the outside, was the perfect way to highlight that curly and give it a good look when the light hits it. One of the downsides when you work with angled legs is when it comes time to start gluing things up, it can get a little tricky, just trying to make sure that you're getting even pressure. But it's nothing a couple of 2x4s trimmed to the same angle as the leg can't solve. And then it's time for the more complicated glue up. And this is one of those instances where you just can't have enough clamps, and you kind of got to figure it out as you're putting things together. And a key to doing it this way is making sure that you're using a glue that has a little bit slower setup time, so you have the time to manipulate the pieces and get everything lined up the way you need it. I also figured this was a good time to use some painter's tape around the tight joints. That way I didn't have to mess with wiping everything off with a wet rag. Because something I learned a while ago is that when you're working with a more porous wood like curly maple, it can actually soak into the wood, and you get that glue water mix down in there, and it just is not going to come out with sanding. So it's best to tape it off just to save yourself the headache. So here's something that I should have mentioned earlier. When I was putting that 15-degree chamfer on the inside edge of that straight piece that connects the 4 leg pieces together, I made sure and I stopped short of the intersection where the 2 front legs tie in. Had I not done that, there would be a void where the 2 came together, and it would just look god awful. But luckily I had the foresight to remember to stop, and so it just leaves me to do this little bit of carving to clean it up. And I actually really enjoy things like this. Believe it or not, I wasn't always this old salty SOB. And when I was a younger man, was really into art, and in particular carving. In fact, a big focus of my high school years was art, and I was pretty dang good at it. Hell, I even figured I'd go to college for it. But when the time came to make the decision, I realized that the term starving artist was a real thing, and I didn't want to spend 4 years waiting to find out if it was going to happen to me. Plus, I was learning electrical work at the time and making pretty darn good money at that, so I figured I'd just stick with that and get back to the art stuff when I had free time, which I guess in a roundabout way led me to woodworking, and so here I am, just whittling away at this table leg trying to make everything line up. So with the base about where I want it, I can turn my attention back to the top and just run it through the planer a couple times to get rid of all that extra epoxy. And then I can finally do a quick test to see how it all looks lined up. And I think this piece is going to turn out pretty good. Now you can see the one end right there has a curve cut on it and the other one doesn't. And that's just because I wanted to do a quick test early on to see how the curved edge would look against a live edge front. I really enjoy the design side of woodworking. It's just really cool to see something in your head and then be able to actually put it together and bring it to life. And in doing all this kind of stuff, there's little tricks that I've picked up that I just think look good. It's not like it's a rule, Hell, there may be rules to design. I don't know what they are. I just know what I think looks good. And one of those things is to carry features through the whole piece. So my intent was to have the curve of the inside of the legs match the curve on the end of this live edge. Now, when I first cut that curve, that was with the original square chunky leg. So obviously there's a new curve layout for these new legs. Luckily it was inside the old one, so all I had to do was just trim it down and we're good to go. But this thing is actually shaping up to be a pretty cool piece, and I'm really happy with how it's turning out. Now, one of the many little issues that you'll run into when you're custom designing furniture is you can't just go to the store and buy a piece to bring things together. And especially with these narrow legs that I had to come up with a way to be able to attach them to the base so everything looks seamless. Luckily, I could just get some 4-inch steel, drill the holes that I need, hit it with a shot coat of spray paint, and we're ready to rock and roll. Now, when it comes to mounting the plates to the base, insetting them is the way to go. It's just a super clean look, it's seamless, and it's not that hard to do. You can actually set a template up like I was setting up earlier, and then I realized I'd just freehand it and it would be fine. One, this isn't going to a customer's house. And two, if anybody has a problem with the way that I attach the base to the top, they can go have a cocktail somewhere else. I talk about sanding a good bit in my videos because you really do need to take the time and do it right. And I've also said I'm one of the ones that's in the camp of I really don't mind sanding. Again, I just pop in my earbuds, listen to some good music, and just get after it. All that said, though, I was regretting my stance on that when it came time to sand this thing. Between the 15-degree chamfer on the inside edge and the thumbnail profile on the outside edge, this thing was an absolute pain to sand. But, as with everything else, all you can do is get after it. And even when you're facing a monumental task like hours of sanding, you just got to remember one thing. Difficult, long tasks like this are like eating an elephant. You just got to do it one bite at a time, and eventually you'll get to the end of it. Now, there's an old saying when it comes to woodworking, and that's if a piece isn't level when it's sitting at your house, you need to level your floors. But in all reality, that was before leg levelers were such an easy thing to get and install. And they really are just a simple way to make sure that everything's going to sit right. And you really don't need to overthink them. You don't have to get some super expensive fancy leg leveler. The freaking $3 pack of 10 that you get off Amazon is good for 90% of what you're going to do. Especially when a piece like this doesn't really have that much weight to it. Another thing I forgot to mention is that when you're using a router on curly wood, it has a tendency to want to tear out. Luckily for me, it was just in this one spot, and I was able to get some CA glue under the piece and kind of pin it back down as it dried. So after a quick sanding, you really couldn't see it. Plus the fact that this maple had so much figure to it that trying to find that little bit of CA glue would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And speaking of figure, where do you see this thing pop when the finish hits it? That stuff is absolutely gorgeous. It's actually one of my favorite woods to work with, but you have to be real careful with it. That grain pattern can get so crazy that it'll kind of outshine everything else around it. But luckily for me on this piece, the top was kind of muted, so pairing it with this busy base worked out perfect. I'd like to say I planned it all along, but sometimes you get lucky. So when you're dealing with trying to finish an odd-shaped piece like this, it can be a real pain in the butt. But honestly, now that I've switched to the UV cured finishes, dealing with this kind of stuff is just a breeze now. I mean, it really is just wipe on, buff off, quick pass with the light, and then you just get on with it. And speaking of getting on with it, if you've hung around this long, I'm just going to have to assume that you've enjoyed some part of this, whether it's watching me fumble through stuff or my silky smooth voice. But no matter the reason why you're still here, it would be awesome if you could hit like and subscribe and give me the support that I need to keep making videos like this. It really does help a bunch and goes a long way towards making all this worthwhile. Alright, heads up. Old man rant coming in. But do you ever stop and think about how good we actually have it as woodworkers nowadays? I mean, take something as simple as these threaded inserts. For years, our only options were crappy wood screws, drywall screws, or maybe some lags that have been sitting in the bottom of a drawer for a while. But now we have these things that are as easy as the click of a button, and all you got to do is spend a couple minutes tracking down a good one. Which, by the way, get the good ones, not the crappy zinc ones. Those things aren't worth a damn. They strip out and they ain't going to hold nothing. So spend the extra 25 cents and get the good ones. All right, back to the task at hand. So a quick wipe down with the UV finish, a pass with the light, and then what the hell is that? You have got to be shitting me. So it turns out the paint points that I set this thing on ended up putting a dent in the damn wood, which I still don't understand because mulberry's hard as hell, but it's also heavy as hell, so somehow that outruled the hardness of it. So here I am stripping and redoing the top, not to mention the fact that remember the crappy epoxy that had been sitting in my drawer for a year that I decided to use? Well, once I planed it down, it exposed a bunch of air bubbles that were in there and I couldn't see them. Thank God some Total Boat had showed up in the time in between and I was able to patch it all. But it just goes to show you, don't rush through anything. And God forbid you wait a day for the good stuff to show up so you don't make more work for yourself. All right, deep breaths. Let's get back after it. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I've been experimenting with UV finishes. And at the moment, I've settled on clean armors. It's relatively easy to apply, but really for me, the kicker of it is that the light you need is only $350. Now, all that said, there are some things that I'm not wild about, and one of them is it just can't match the look and feel of hard wax oil, which is hands down my favorite wood finish. Luckily, I found a workaround, and that brings us to this video's sponsor, and that's Carbon Method. Their nano finish gives wood an extra layer of protection and gives a sheen that is absolutely beautiful. It's relatively inexpensive for what it is, it's easy to apply, and you just can't beat the result. They even make a version for your cast iron tool beds, but I'll cover that in a different video. Plus they have these things called bench nuts, which you can't really see right now, but it's what's holding my piece up off the tabletop. And if I would have had the bench nuts at the beginning of this build, I wouldn't have had to redo the top because of those stupid paint points that, funny enough, are now in the trash can because screw those things, I have bench nuts. All right, well, I guess it's time to wrap this thing up. Now, even though it was a pain in the rear to redo the legs and refinish the top, this was still a really fun build, and I'm really happy with how the base turned out and the overall look of the piece. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, this is John with Olive Grove Woodshop. Keep on building.